Hey guys, it's Casey and welcome back to my channel. How are you? I myself am doing pretty well actually. I'm doing really well. Yesterday was a bit of a doozy of a day in that we had a bit of a natural phenomenon happen in town. We had what I can only call as rainbow clouds appear in the sky, which I will put a video up here. You've probably never seen them. In all my many years, had never seen anything like it. It was really beautiful. It was really pretty. And it just so happened to send my best friend Nate into a very brief but very peculiar episode of religious psychosis. Don't worry, I snapped him out of it pretty quickly after it became apparent to me what was happening. But in honor of that unexpected experience, I figured today we will celebrate the appearance of the rainbow clouds and Nate's momentary break with reality by me explaining in full the story of how my best friend in the entire timeline of this world went from being a member of a murder cult to being my hospital's lead and best, in my opinion, sorry Tan, the best nurse practitioner that we've ever had in only a few years. But before we can get to the schmurder portion of tonight's video, I feel like it's best that we begin at the beginning so everybody is working with the same deck of cards as we move through the story. At least as close to the beginning as I can get, because the true beginning of this story occurred long before I ever entered the scene. So we will work with what we've got. Roll the intro. Not really, because the intro at this point in the video would have already been long rolled. So dramatic pause for effect, I guess. The year was 2019. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Notre Dame was on fire. Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister of Britain. Aliona Kostanaya, my greatest love, had just perfected the greatest triple axel that humankind has ever seen. Foodie Beauty had just moved into the villa with Pete's and was about to commence on what would soon become the most obscene manic episode ever seen on God's green internet. And somewhere in a small wet market in central China, a teeny tiny organism was rapidly mutating to become a lethal respiratory virus that would very soon bring the entire world to a screeching halt. And at the same time as all of that was occurring, I, Casey Escamilla, was being shipped off to work after spending the better part of 2 years pretty much abandoned in a small inner city Melbourne apartment to my own devices. I was being shipped off to work as the head, and at the time only, doctor in the world's shittest medical clinic on the edge of the Australian outback. And look, I know that I say all the time, and anybody who has ever watched a single one of my videos can account to this, I say all the time that I currently work in the world's worst hospital, and I stand by that statement and I will say it with my full chest. However, in comparison to what it was when I first arrived in 2019, my hospital today looks like Grace Sloan Memorial Hospital in comparison. It was so bad when I first arrived in 2019. We had no internet, not a single connection anywhere. You could not get reception for internet, whether it was on your phone or on a computer. Wasn't happening. The only reason that we have internet today is because of Skylink. We had, and still have to this day, but because again we have internet now, it's not so much of a big deal. We had no phone reception or very dicey phone reception on a good day. Most days, no phone reception. We were almost entirely reliant on generators because the power grid that we were on was so dicey that it would just drop out for hours at a time with no explanation of why it was dropping out, which is still true today. We still are reliant on generators, but the power's a little bit better these days. And because we had no internet and we had no reliable phone connection, we, in an emergency, if we needed to contact somebody in the big year of 2019, we had to use a telegram machine. in 2019. That is how we connected to the outside world if someone had to like cut off their arm in a farming accident and needed to be flown out to a bigger hospital. That's it. And that is without even going into the human aspect of my hospital, because we were getting held up, armed robberies, like every other month, at least every other month. And again, that is without even accounting for all the creepy stuff that just naturally happens and continues to happen within the walls of my hospital. So when I first started at the hospital, the entire full-time employee roster consisted of me. That's it. I was the one and only full-time employee for a very long time. For a very, very long time. I mean, technically, Tan and Kels also worked there at the time, but when I started, they were both out on work cover or workers' comp, whatever you want to call it in your country. Point is that they were out, they remained out for like a good year and a half, 2 years after I started. And so, you know, even though they were technically employees, they weren't actually on the floor at all in any capacity. And so it was basically just me, at least for the first several weeks that I was working there. And then my friend Jared came, but even then, he was part of the prison work release program. And no, I think it's okay. Jared's dead. He's been dead for a few years now. So I can tell you this, there's no consequences to telling you what he did. So Jared had gotten drunk one night at a pub and he punched some guy in the head and he died. And so Jared got sentenced to like 11 years in prison. But because we're in the outback and we have no resources to, you know, not a lot of medical professionals want to come and work out here, Jared was also a qualified pharmacist, and so instead of going to prison after a couple of years, he was allowed to be released to come and work at the hospital with us, and so that's what he did. He worked part-time as the pharmacist, and he worked part-time as our courier, because the courier service that we had used prior to Jared refused to come out to our town anymore after the quote-unquote bear incident, which I can tell you about as well, because I personally am not sure what I think about it. It's not my story. I wasn't there. I can't promise how much of it is true, but long story short, the courier service guy, he was late to the town one day and it was already dark by the time he had finished his work, and so he went to go get dinner at the pub and had a few drinks, and by the time he actually left, it was like 1 a.m. in the morning, and it's a very long drive back to the city, a very, very, very long drive. And so partway there, he was like, I'm just going to pull over on the side of the road and go to sleep. And like I said, long story short, he ended up getting kidnapped by some ferals. And according to him, the only way that he survived the night is that some giant guy in a bear costume pretty much came and Captain Americaned him and saved his life. Take of that what you will. I'm not sure how much of it I take, but there you go. That is the bear story. But it wasn't just the courier service who wouldn't come to our town anymore, because when I first started working here, we were part of a placement program for student nurses. But then a few months after I was here, the university that we were in a partnership with for them to send us student nurses so we could, you know, teach them, they banned students from coming to a hospital anymore because it was deemed too dangerous, which, you know, makes sense with all the assaults that happen from patients and the armed robberies and the hold-ups and the other weird stuff going on. And, you know, it's just me and Jared at this point in time in a hospital. So I couldn't blame, you know, young 19-year-old girls for not wanting to come and work at my hospital. I wouldn't have wanted to work at my hospital if I had literally any choice in the matter. And so we had a huge nursing shortage that we kind of filled in by hiring international nurses who were here on a working holiday visa. But that, and we still do that. That's how we primarily get our nurses to this day. We now have, the government makes nurses from a nearby, like the next town over, which is not a short drive, but still, you know, the government makes them come and fill in the gaps 3 to 4 days a week. So we do have that coverage as well. But yeah, having the international nurses wasn't great because clearly they're not here to work, they're here to party and have fun. And so it wasn't a great way to fill in a labour shortage, but it was all we had. Now, onwards and upwards to the part that you actually came here to listen to. A few years before I moved to this town, so 2016, 2017-ish, one of the cattle stations that border our town was put up for sale, and the people who ended up buying it were part of a self-proclaimed spiritual wellness group. And they brought it with the intentions of converting the cattle station into a compound for sovereign citizens, where they were planning to do, I can't even begin to tell you, probably like brew kombucha or hold hands and sing kumbaya around the campfire while roasting marshmallows, anything along those lines. Anything except for doing what they ended up doing with the place. Because what ended up happening is that very quickly they ended up taking a sharp left-hand turn towards hell and devolved into what can only be called a schmurder cult, or really a schmurder religion, as Nate insists on calling it, insists that we all call it in his presence, because according to him, the C word is offensive and provocative. But I'm not going to explicitly say the group's name in this video, because unfortunately they still do have a website, and I don't want to drive any traffic towards it, because over the past couple of years they have kind of revived themselves from the ashes, even though it's now run by different people, and I think they're more sincerely, love and peace rather than blow up the moon. I guess I should tell you a little bit about their ideology so you know exactly what I'm working with here, and I'm not just saying that, oh, my best friend was in a cult for clicks and views. Like, no, they were what they were. They were exactly what they said that they were, and it was a very dangerous group with a very dangerous ideology, in the same vein as the Manson family or Jamestown. They sincerely, with pure intentions, wanted to blow up the moon. Their ideology believed that humankind existed to fulfill two moral imperatives: to increase happiness while decreasing suffering. So a successfully lived life, in their opinion, was one that increased happiness more than it increased suffering. And with this in mind, they could basically break down your entire existence into a mathematical statistical rubrics to examine how much happiness you brought versus how much suffering you brought, and from that they would determine whether you were a good person or a bad person. A bit like the Wizard of Oz, whether you're a good witch or a bad witch, just much more scientific. If a person has a negative spread, that is to say that they increased suffering more than they increased happiness, or they decreased happiness more than they decreased suffering, then put very simply, looking at the mathematical equation of the rubrics, that person is inherently bad and must be punished under their ideology. That also means that if somebody caused a tremendous amount of suffering, but at the same time caused a tremendous amount of happiness in their lifetime, then one just simply needed to look at the rubrics to determine their moral standing. The core tenet of their belief system is that humans have been forever going about the concept of good and bad in the completely wrong way, because our emphasis has always been on increasing happiness, when instead it should have been on decreasing suffering, because happiness is a fluid concept. It is ever changing, and the more happiness you have, the harder it is to sustain, whereas suffering is pure and eternal. It is constant and passive, and therefore, in order for someone to be a truly good person, they must end all suffering in the world, which is why the cult's ultimate goal was to end all life on Earth, not just, by the moon, but they had a lot of different plans that they were focusing on and building towards, which all ended in more or less the same way that you can imagine. Which brings me to Nathaniel Worthington Wigglebottom III, which is not his real name, by the way. It is one of his many personas. When I first met Nate, I wasn't aware that his name was Nate. And I wasn't aware that his name was Nate until I'd known him for over a year. That's how bad it was. And that was partly by design, because as part of joining the cult, they were supposed to give up all their worldly connections, so their friends and their family and their property and their money and their names, for the good of the community. And so they weren't supposed to call each other by their names, and so we never knew their names. And as part of joining the cult, they weren't supposed to leave the compound until they had reached the second level of enlightenment. But many of the new cultists weren't very good cultists, and so they would sneak down to a hospital pretty much every single day, we would have a group of cultists dressed in white who wouldn't look or talk to anyone in a hospital. Because my hospital just so happens to have the only 24/7, 7 days a week shop in about a 500-kilometer radius, like not even the 24-hour petrol station is actually open 24 hours a day. They close like 7 p.m. most nights. So I don't know why they call themselves a 24-hour petrol station, but they do. Whatever. None of my business. I like to leave people to their own devices, and so I don't question it. But the point is that we would have all these cultists coming in to buy coffee and cigarettes and tea and hot food and lollies and chocolate and all that good stuff. And they weren't technically, I don't think, supposed to be trying to recruit new members to the compound into, again, they had reached the second level of enlightenment. But there was one specific cult member who was so enthusiastic about the message he was trying to spread throughout the world that he could not help himself. Now, this specific cult member, he would show up at the hospital every 3 days, like clockwork, pretty much at the same time, every single 3 days, like clockwork, he would show up and he would buy a packet of cigarettes and a Cadbury chocolate bar, specifically this Cadbury chocolate bar here. And because he had no name, I took to calling him Cadbury, because what else was I supposed to identify him by? I didn't feel like calling him cigarette, so I called him Cadbury. And every single day, Cadbury would trot on over like a little golden retriever, and he would try to convince me to follow him back to the compound, where he promised that enlightenment and pancakes awaited me, but I never went because, frankly, I have had enough enlightenment in my life. Thank you very much. I did not require his brand of enlightenment. And he never got discouraged by that. He would just smile, pay for his little chocolate and cigarettes, and then he would bounce on, and 3 days later he would be back and we would go through the whole routine again. And that was that. Until one day, a block of 3 days come and go, and Cadbury is nowhere to be found. And then another 3 days come and go. Another 3 days come and go. And still, he is a no-show. I have no idea where he's disappeared to. And part of me is hoping that he has seen the light and he has quit the cult and he's gone home to his family, wherever that may be. That is the only thought that I gave to it for the entire time that he was missing. Then the weekend came around, and it's about 7 a.m. in the morning, and a minivan bus, pulls up out front of the hospital, and about 20 cultists get off this bus and they enter the cafe, and they are in the best mood that you have ever seen anybody in your entire life. These people who prior to this moment in time had never said so much as a single word that was not required of them to speak to anybody were chatting away as if everyone in the room was their best friend, and they're wishing everybody a best solstice, they're wishing everybody a great feast, they're chatting, they're hugging, they're high-fiving everyone, and they clear out our entire non-perishable stock. We do not have so much as a bottle of water left in our shop when they leave. And this is not an isolated experience. They have done this to almost every single business in town. They have cleared out all the beer in town except for the ones that was in the pub. They have cleared out all the junk food. They have cleared out the butchers. They have cleared out the IGA. Everything is gone. They have brought up everything, and they were talking to everyone, and it was very, very weird because, again, they were non-social. They refused to talk to anyone prior to this moment, and still, Cadbury was nowhere to be found. So the cultists brought out our entire stock. Like I said, did not leave a single bottle of water behind. They got back onto their minivan and they disappeared into the sunset, never to be seen or heard from again. And I do mean that literally. From the moment that bus pulled away, we never had so much as a glimpse of another cultist in the hospital, in the town, in anywhere that I know ever again. Until, guess who comes trotting along into my hospital? Well, it's no one other than Mr. Cadbury himself, and he is happy as a pig in shite. and he grabs himself a couple of Cadbury bars, and because by this point in time we have replenished our stock, he grabs a couple of Cadbury bars and he grabs himself a hot dog and he comes up to pay for it. And I'm like, hey, keeping in mind, again, I am never social with this guy. He just bounces up and he tries to give me his little spiel about following him back to the compound. But this day I'm like, hey, because the cultists have disappeared, hey, are you excited for the feast? And he's like, hey, yourself, like, what feast are you talking about? I'm like, dude, come on, I'm not an idiot. I can put two and two together, all the buying up of everything in town, all the singing, all the hugging, all the socialization where before you wouldn't even make eye contact with people. I can put two and two together, something is going down up there. I'm not curious about a lot, but I'm curious about this. I want to know what's happening. What's the 411 with the feast? And I watched as the colour physically drained from Cadbury's face. And without a word, he grabbed his chocolate bars, did not pay for them, by the way, and he turned and he ran out of the hospital. And keep in mind, I am the only doctor who is working this hospital at this point in time. And so this was the morning shift. I had the day shift off, and then I had to come back to the hospital to work the night shift that night. So I went home after my shift, my first shift, went to sleep, got up, went back to work. And when I got back to work that night, Cadbury was in the cafe and his head was down on the table and he was crying hysterically. And Tegan was there, who at this point in time was like the receptionist slash working in the cafe serving whoever was coming. And she sees me and she goes, oh my God, thank God you're here. Can you talk to him? I'm like, what? Talk to him about what? I am not the kind of person who talks to people about this kind of thing. Like, what could I possibly talk to him about? I don't know why he's crying. And she's like, well, he's been asking for you. And that was the last thing that he said before he like broke down into a blubbering mess. And I have to go on a date tonight, so can you like deal with it? I need to leave right now. I've been here longer than I'm supposed to be. So I'm like, okay, whatever. I'm like, hey buddy, like what's going on? I sat down with him, and over the course of like 5 free cups of coffee and a free family-sized bag of Doritos, I managed to weasel the entire story out of him, where he had been sent off on some kind of vision quest by the elders of his church. And it was like a 2-week-long quest where he had to live alone in the woods, living off the fat of the land and foraging and scavenging for food, which, knowing Nate now, I have my doubts about how true that is in reality, and just genuinely communing with nature. He had just finished his trial that morning and was about to return home to the compound and had stopped at the cafe on his way back to pick up some cigarettes and his usual chocolate when I had told him about the feast and everything that had gone down with the cultists over the course of the weekend. Apparently the feast was like the most holy day on their calendar, kind of like the love child of a graduation ceremony and Christmas morning and a rock star orgy all rolled into one. And it was something that he'd been looking forward to since like day one of the cult's resurrection. So after he'd spoken to me that morning and I told him about everything that had gone on with the cultists in town and asked him what the feast was all about, he had rushed immediately back to the compound. But when he got there, nobody was there. Everyone was gone. And when I say gone, I mean literally gone. There was no note, there was no calling card, there was no forwarding address, just everyone was gone. Beds were left unmade, there was still food on the table, there was still a fire in the little kitchen area, like the stove behind where they cooked things. The fire was still lit in there. All the cultists' personal belongings and their clothes were still in their milk crate cartons behind their beds. It's just all the people had vanished and he had no idea where they had gone. He just kind of waited there to see if anyone returned in hope that, you know, maybe they had all just gone on a group excursion to bushwalk and they were returning, but no one returned, and so he was forced to accept the reality, what he called the reality, that while he was off on his little vision quest, they had all had the feast without him, and they had essentially graduated and ascended to the second stage and moved on to the second secret location that apparently they had brought once upon a time. But he didn't know where it was, and they hadn't waited for him to come back, and he was very, very distraught about that. Now, in hindsight, 7 years later, we know that what really happened is that they all cut themselves, but we didn't know that at the time, okay? All I knew is that I had a hysterically crying cultist making very loud sobbing sounds in my hospital cafe. And I needed him to stop doing that. And this is really, really bad. This was bad form, and it's indicative of the kind of person that I am, I think. But I went and I got Jared from the pharmacy, and together we managed to move Cadbury from the cafe to the furthest most patient room, and we closed the door on him while he continued to sob on the bed. And I just figured at that point in time that he would work things out for himself and then eventually, get himself together and go back to whatever life he was living before he joined said cult. And this way he wasn't going to be, scaring or bothering our patients. So that's what we did. Like I said, I am not proud of that in hindsight, okay? Now that Nate is like my best friend in this entire world, I'm not proud of that, but that is what we did that night. And the night shift passed, and the morning shift passed, and the day shift passed, and it was the night shift again. And in all that drama, we kind of forgot that Cadbury was in the patient room. And two, I don't remember what caused him to do it, but eventually he threw open the door and was like, "Can you shut up down there? I'm trying to sleep right now." And it's like, oh God, he's still in there. We got to do something about that. And so we called Jeff, who was the police officer at the time, who was in charge of babysitting the hospital, who also right now is unfortunately also deceased, which is very sad because he was a very good person and I miss him a lot. But on the flip side, we now have Officer Hart, who's in charge of babysitting the hospital, and Michelle is in charge of the police force. So that's, silver linings and all that. Jeff comes, he takes Cadbury to the bigger hospital in the big town, and we thought that was that was going to be the last time we ever saw him. Obviously that is not what happened, because he's still my best friend to this day, because we thought he would go back to his normal life. Apparently what he wanted after getting checked out over there, to make sure that there was no illicit substance, because at this point in time Jeff had been notified that what had gone down at the compound, and they were investigating it, and they were pretty sure what happened. And so they needed to investigate, they needed to check Cadbury to make sure that, he hadn't done anything along those lines. Apparently what Cadbury really wanted after getting checked out was to be driven back to my hospital. So Jeff drove him back to my hospital and didn't tell us. And Cadbury more or less moved into the patient room for a very long time. And he was there, and he just kind of started helping out around the hospital. And as it turned out, while he was in the cult, he had an undergraduate degree and a master's degree in engineering, but that wasn't, it was useful to the cult because they wanted to, the moon. But what they wanted him to do is that they needed him to kind of be a nurse. So he got his nursing degree while he was part of the cult. And so he was a qualified nurse, and the owner, because our hospital is privately owned, we get funding from the government, but it's a privately owned hospital. The owner was really impressed that he could stay inside the hospital for so long, because we kind of forgot that he was there, and no one else was really supposed to be in the hospital for a long period of time, but we forgot that he was there. And so he just kind of lived in the back room, and they were so impressed that he managed to stay in the hospital for such a long time without, going insane, that they offered him a job. So he started working in our hospital as a nurse, because again, he is a registered nurse. The cult put him through nursing school. Which is still so funny for me to think about, because he is probably one of the smartest people that I've ever met in my entire life. He knows so much stuff about so much different illicit things to do with. But he is a very gifted nurse. He's very good at working with patients who are non-compliant, even if his bedside manner does leave a lot to the imagination. He does like to do things like paint patients' nails while they're in comas, and he likes to draw tattoos on them and do things like that, brush their hair. He's very weird. He's a very weird guy, my Nate, but I love him so much. He is my platonic common law husband, and I would not have it any other way. He has saved my life more than probably anybody else alive, which is really saying something. He is the ultimate ride or die. He is the ultimate golden retriever boyfriend. I once got arrested and put into holding, and he got himself arrested. He was in a different place at the time. He wasn't with me, but when he found out, Nate got himself arrested so that I wouldn't have to sit in holding alone, which I thought was really, really sweet. But the way that he got arrested was kind of funny, in that He tried to sell a little baggie of white powder, if you catch my drift, to a couple of the local police officers, and that was a failure because they actually wanted to buy it. And so he just ended up jumping on top of their bonnet of their car and like twerking until they arrested him, and he got to come and hold him with me. But that's just the kind of friend that he is, and I love him so much, and if it wasn't for the stupid cult, I would have never met him. But yeah, there you go. That is my story for the night. That is my Nathan that I love, despite the fact that he is prone to, again, stumbling every now and then into delusions of religious ideology to do with said cult. But that's none of my business, and he always comes back out of them, so I can't complain. But for right now, this is Casey signing off for the night. As always, stay weird out there, stay safe, and have a productive evening.